Good afternoon and welcome to an Innovation Forum webinar on strategies to develop smallholder farmer livelihoods and productivity. My name is Boris Petrovic. I work on ethical trade and soft commodity sustainability for Innovation Forum. I will be your moderator today. This webinar will explore how companies can create strategies to develop the smallholder bases that supply their soft commodities. Given the experience of our panel, the discussion will have a particular focus on sugarcane farming, but we will also look to explore the transferable lessons that can be taken from other crop experiences. For our panel this afternoon, we have a distinguished assortment of representatives from the leading NGOs in this space. We have Sven Seelhurst, Program Coordinator for Sugarcane from Solidaridad, Junie Sewell, Private Sector Advisor on Agricultural Markets and Enterprise for Oxfam, and finally John Walker, Product Manager for Sugar at the Fair Trade Foundation. Welcome to all, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. To explain the format of the webinar before we begin, there are no slides. This is not a presentation. It's a structured panel discussion throughout with a question and answer session at the end. As an audience member, you can get involved by posting questions that come through to the moderator, which I will put to our panel in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. You will also receive a recording of this webinar via email, which I urge you to share with any colleagues that may be interested. This webinar forms part of the build-up to the Sustainable Sugar Forum, which is a conference we are holding next month in London on the 16th and 17th of June, where the leading sugar companies, corporates, and NGOs gather to address the commercial opportunities of sustainability for the sugar, beet, and sugarcane communities. We currently have 90 people confirmed for that event, but delegate passes are still available. So please see the information on the website URL, which is on your screen now, to find out more. I do apologize that we've ran a little bit late. We did have some technical difficulties just prior to starting, but I think we're all good now. So I'll kick off the webinar discussion. And I thought a particularly good way to start this discussion around smallholders, given the fact that it is a pretty novel topic in terms of the corporate agenda on sustainability for a lot of food companies, and such as Nestle or Unilever, for example. Sven, I thought it would be good to start off with you in just terms of broadly talking about why are we even discussing smallholders as a problem opportunity? Why should we be talking about this?
Sure, Boris, that's okay. I think when you look at smallholders and their position in agriculture and in a larger economic setting, you can look at it in many ways, but I think we're all very aware of the challenges that we see as a global population for the next few decades, in which we will have to hugely increase our production of agricultural goods to feed the world population that is still growing and going to be more affluent. And if you look where the potential is to grow productivity, that's really with smallholder farmers in the world. We have about 500 million small-scale farmers in the world, many of them actually subsistence farmers, and only a fraction of that being included in commercial supply chains. But the yield gaps for those farmers are considerable. And so if we look at where solutions lie to that challenge, or the answers lie to that challenge, the assets that are currently managed by smallholder farmers is certainly a space where we should look at. That's, let's say, from a problem perspective. But from an opportunity perspective, there's a lot of research that indicates that investments in agriculture from a development point of view are some of the most interesting investments, as, let's say, the return on those investments in development terms is very high. And so there's a challenge, there's a need, and there's a growing market, and there is an imperative because to invest, because a lot of those farmers are currently part of the world's poorest population groups.
I see. And John, if I can bring you in here as well, just sort of build on what Sven said around sort of the necessity to engage with the topic. Maybe we could just talk a little bit more about sort of, for example, the risk around sort of smallholder farming, because as Sven said, we are going to need, the reason that we need to do this is just there's a growing population on the earth. We are going to be consuming more, and smallholders present a good proportion of the people that actually produce the stuff that we consume. So what are the sort of, for example, the major risks that you can see with the work that you've done for smallholders?
Thank you, Boris. Sven put that very succinctly. Thank you, Sven. when we look at the issues that are facing smallholders, and I think just in the context of this conversation before I start, it's important to point out that we're not sure, but we think that around 40% of the world's sugarcane is produced by smallholders. So in the context of this conversation about sugarcane sustainability leading up to your event, it's very relevant. When we think about the issues that smallholders are facing, they face issues such as lack of access to finance, which causes lack of access to inputs, which causes low productivity, and you can get trapped in a cycle there. There's also issues around the communities that the smallholders are living in. So these can often be isolated communities with lack of access to electricity, water, or to schooling. And, you know, in that context, you can envisage smallholders moving away from farming. It would be no great surprise for smallholders to be moving away from farming. A lot of the sugarcane farming communities that I've seen around the world, the average age of the sugar farmer is not a young one. They tend to be older people who are involved in sugarcane farming. And you see this replicated across different commodities. You see it replicated in cocoa, for instance, in West Africa as well, where I believe the average age is in the 50s. So there are some really good reasons around the continuation of supply for everybody to be interested in investment in smallholder production. And also there are some good reasons around those three pillars of sustainability, economic, and social and environmental.
I see. And you mentioned sort of farmer succession as being one of the sort of common issues, as you can see pretty much in all commodity production. And Junie, if I could just bring you in here, because Junie is almost the non-sugar speaker on our panel. She's done work with a good amount of work with Unilever around different types of commodities like tea and tomato. But I'll have you explain a bit more about that. But can I just ask you, in terms of some of the cross-cutting issues or risks that you can see being sort of relevant pretty much to sort of across commodities, what are those?
Sure. Maybe I can start off by just explaining what we are doing with Unilever, between Oxfam and Unilever, in a partnership called Project Sunrise. So we've been firstly doing a pilot together on onions for dehydration in Azerbaijan. And then we went on to research existing smallholder supply chains where Unilever were already trading with smallholders to some degree. So that was tea in Kenya and soybean in Indonesia and tomato in India. So what we got was a pretty good cross-section of different crops in different countries, but all involving smallholders. And I'd say that there's obviously a number of challenges that affect agriculture generally, but what you really have with smallholders is particularly the lower capacity. So as Sven already mentioned before, I think John alluded to this as well, productivity is really a key issue. You typically see about half of the what a commercial plantation would achieve in productivity in smallholders, and sometimes much less than even half. So that's really the first challenge. And then the second challenge is in aggregation. So of course, with the big commercial supply chains, you can't be sourcing from each smallholder household directly, and so you really need an aggregator in the middle. And this is really key for the strategy in terms of engaging with smallholders, because if you have a good aggregator that you can reliably trade with as a lead firm, a global firm, then you're really able to reach the smallholders as well much more effectively through the aggregator. So that could be a processing factory, it could be a co-op, a large co-op, or it could be a trading company. And if you're able to really interact very well with that aggregator entity, who then in turn invests in smallholder capacity, then you really have the key ingredients for a good smallholder supply chain. And then lastly, I would just say the really important thing to understand with smallholder agriculture is also that it's a household in the agriculture business. for the smallholders. So you can pretty safely assume that all members of the household are to some degree involved, hopefully not the children, but definitely both the husband and the wife would be involved in the agriculture. And there you can also try to target your interventions much better, because very often the woman won't be visible in the supply chain. If you have any trainings, if you have any kind of workshops, then often it will be the male farmer who comes to the workshop for cultural and also just household reasons. But if you are leaving out the women who might be doing the post-harvest processing, for example, or might also be doing direct field work, then you're really leaving out pretty much half the potential productivity gain. So those are some of the key some of the key factors I would mention.
I see. And we'll get on to much more later on in the discussion as to how to sort of create a strategy, and some of the insights definitely I think will be applicable from the crops that you've done or studied and worked on with Unilever to sugarcane. I do hope. I don't know that, but I'm pretty confident on that. Now I just wanted to focus a little bit more on sugar, and I'll rely on Sven and John sort of for the insight on what the sugar value chain for sugarcane actually looks like, just so that we have some context before we get into sort of the intricacies of the problems and so forth. And that would just be to explain exactly how the value chain looks from farmer to end buyer. And Sven, would you be able just to give us a little bit of background in terms of how the typical grain of sugar, say for example, goes from, I don't know, a smallholder farm to, I don't know, a packet of Tate & Lyle's sugar, for example, just to give us a bit more context?
Well, probably John is the one who knows the answer to the Tate & Lyle specific question, but generally speaking, of course, there's always differences in the world in how supply chains are organized, but I would say generally speaking, a sugar mill is a very central point where sugar cane gets crushed and turned into sugar. And most mills in the world have their own estates or estates under their own management where they grow cane. And some mills in the world, in large parts of the world, are also supplied by third-party cane growers. And those can be, let's say, the more commercial cane growers, as they're often called, who have 50 to 100 hectares, and a more typical small-scale suppliers, which is really a few hectares, basically. And so they supply to the mill. The mill makes raw sugar out of it, which can then be shipped to any place in the world, really, where it can be refined to more specialized products, and is then traded to end users. Most of the sugar that we consume, particularly in the Western world, reaches the consumer in the form of a processed food product, and so not in the form of sugar, table sugar that we actually see as such. And so in most cases, sugar really reaches the consumer as what we call a hidden ingredient. And so that's one thing. And the other thing that I think is specific about sugar, and maybe slightly less so about other commodities, is that sugar to a very large extent is being consumed domestically, so is largely being consumed in the country of production, and the international amount of sugar traded is in absolute terms still quite big, but in relative terms is quite minor if you look at the total sugar consumption.
I see. And John, Sven pretty much said you're probably the man to ask about this. So just in terms of explaining kind of I suppose a good way to sort of identify some of the issues around sugar cane sustainability anyway would just be look at sort of the different portions of the value chain between sort of the farmer, the mills, the traders, etc. And just to look at the sort of where the economic interests of the value chain differ. Where are there tensions? Presumably they're not entirely in harmony. That could potentially lead to sort of sustainability issues. Are there any ones that particularly come to mind?
Well, Thanks, Boris, and thank you, Sven. I thought that was well summarised. I think that I'd like to pick up on your point, Boris, and also just like to pick up on something we were talking about in terms of the way that that sugar is processed. And I think this is a really important point when you're talking about sugar sustainability. As Sven quite rightly said, the mill is a central point. The smallholders will go to the mill. Now, typically, the smallholders will only have one mill that they can sell to. It was quite unusual for you to get, or I've never seen it actually, to get a case where the smallholders have a range of mills who they can sell to. So there is only one place which they can take their product to. And you know, just thinking about before we move on to the value chain part, just thinking about the sustainability of sugarcane and impacts for smallholders. Because you have this situation where you've got a number of smallholders sending their products to a mill, and the mill then processes the sugarcane. And you know, as soon as that sugar enters the mill, it gets mixed in. Even before it enters the mill, the smallholders' sugar cane will be aggregated with other smallholders' sugar cane and delivered to the mill. So you'll have a range of smallholders delivering product to mill. And that's really important when you're talking about how you're going to implement those sustainability programs in the future, because you need all of the smallholders to be moving at the same pace. And that's really an important thing to hold on to, is that you need them to be moving at the same pace to deliver a quality product to the mill with the highest sucrose content as possible, which then affects the payment that they get. Now, in terms of the relationship with the mill, the smallholders will supply to the mill. As Sven quite rightly said, the mill will quite often then supply onto a refiner, which will refine the sugar. In all of the countries where we've operated, there's been an agreement between the mill and the smallholders around the sharing of revenue. So they'll share the revenue on a formula that's been set, usually with some government intervention. And you know, in theory, that takes some of the potential tension out of the situation. You do have to realise that it's an unusual situation that you've got with sellers only having one buyer that they can go to, but it's a relationship where the two parties are absolutely reliant on each other. The smallholder is reliant on the mill to process the sugar, and the mill is reliant on the smallholder to deliver the sugar to them.
And that pretty much picks up on the point Julie made earlier around aggregators being sort of the means to sort of driving sustainability initiatives. In the case of sugarcane, I would imagine that's pretty much the mill. I know you said they aggregate their sugarcane even probably before it enters the mill, but that is sort of one of the entities that you would presumably use to drive change. I just wanted, yeah, please.
Sorry, Boris, just to come in on that. I mean, I think that's an important point, because a key part of fair trade's methodology is that the part of the supply chain that you want really engaged in the sustainability initiative is the smallholders. So our methodology looks for smallholders to organise into democratic and funded organisations which are representative of their members, and that they then take ownership of some of the sustainability initiatives that are put forward and implement themselves. Because when you have a position where the smallholders are taking ownership, you have a much stronger likelihood of the initiative sticking.
And I suppose that's also, well, it just the thing that you mentioned around the relationship between sort of the mill and the smallholder, it does affect the dynamics of bargaining power and influence if they are organised into a democratic, almost a political unit, as opposed to being a fragmented, atomised sort of collection of independents trying to negotiate with the one mill that they have to pretty much sell to. I just wanted to help build the context a little bit further, because we will get onto sort of the role of corporates and the intricacies of strategy, and for example, and we've touched on a lot of the learning points already. We'll try to summarise them a bit more concisely later on as well. But I just wanted once again to build the context in terms of the lives of farmers, because obviously that is the end point. That this is the the end to the efforts around smallholder development. It's in the name. But just to, and Sven, maybe I can take you on this question. Sugar is a low-value crop. So for people that rely on it as their principal source of livelihoods, how high or low is the ceiling in terms of how far you can improve your life, your income, so forth?
Yeah, I think that's really a critical question when we talk about smallholder development in sugarcane, because you could say it's a low-value crop, but it's also a crop that can bring people substantial growth in their family income, but is limited to, at the end of the day, the amount of land that you have to grow that sugarcane on. And so, if you look at sugarcane that is grown under very good conditions in most countries, you're looking at a net profit of $2,000 to $2,500 probably. And so, if you have a couple of hectares, you can see, okay, what's the maximum family income that is derived out of this crop. And as John alluded to earlier, it's those are often farmers who are in isolated places, and for them it's a commercial crop with a lot of opportunity, but their income growth over time will be kept by how much land they have. And I think that really comes back to your question on the risks on the horizon for smallholders, because I think one of the risks is low economies of scale as farming is getting more capital intensive, but also as labor is becoming more expensive. Economies of scale are more and more important, and they've always been very important in a crop like sugarcane for various reasons that I won't go into. But the ability to organize those economies of scale is really critical, I think, going forward. And while maybe for this generation a family can still live from a few hectares and dramatically improve their income, if you look at 1-2 generations down the line, probably given the price developments in most countries, those 2 or 3 hectares are not sufficient to sustain a family. And so we don't only have to think about how can we maximize productivity within the current smallholder setting, but also what is the longer term vision, because it's not a surprise that the average age of sugarcane farmers in large parts of the world is more than 50, because the potential for growth of the family income is really not comparable to the potential for growth in other sectors.
I see. Once again, farmer succession being the issue, presumably just because it's not really seen as a means to achieve, significant improvements. So, for example, in your livelihood, it does have a very clear ceiling. And I remember, John, when we were talking about sort of the sugar value chain, we had a call prior to this webinar. You mentioned the point that they're limited. The farmers, they're limited in terms of how much of the value chain they can capture, just because they can't really go beyond the mill stage. It's they can't create their own mill. It's far too expensive for them to do. But then they're also limited, presumably, in terms of the land. So the only real option is productivity gains in terms of yield, and then, well, I assume that other metrics like the sucrose content of the sugarcane itself. But I want to just go back to just to sort of help to summarize, and then also just bring Junie in here. What are the common issues that keep smallholder yield and productivity to a fraction of its potential? I realise we've touched on some of the points before, but it would be good to obviously get your perspective and summary.
Sure. There's a number of factors at play, of course. One being, at a very, very basic technical level, the input use. So inputs might not be being used at the right quantity, and that behind that might be because smallholder farmers just don't have the cash to be able to pay for inputs up front. So a lot of commercial smallholder supply chains have this model where the company would provide the inputs up front and then have that on credit until harvest. So that's one way of getting around it. Another way of getting around it is to actually prepay the farmer, so that they would have the money in advance to be able to meet their needs before harvest. But then, kind of secondly, it's not just about the quantity of inputs, of course, but about the techniques in using inputs. And for that, training is really key. And of course, reaching thousands of smallholder farmers to train them is really quite a challenge. Not only just in terms of reach, they are in isolated areas, but also because they might not be highly literate or numerate. So that really means that you have to make training very accessible. It could mean that you really need field officers at a scale that is, might be seen as prohibitively expensive for some. But then there are other ways of getting around it. For example, with video technology, for example, you might be able to reach farmers that are illiterate, but still pass on the message more effectively. So there's a number of things at play, but I'd highlight those two first.
Okay, and so first of all, can I just open it up to Sven and John with the same question in terms of and I realise we've touched on some of this before, but the common issues that keep smallholder yield and productivity to a fraction of its potential.
Would you like to go first, Boris?
Sven, if you would, Sven, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, so I think Ginny touched upon a couple of good ones, which are particularly, I would say emergent stresses that are, let's say, of a very short-term nature, so lack of credit, lack of technological knowledge. I would also say, indeed, as I think Ginny alluded to, a lack of business skills, basic business skills, even to the point that people may be not be able to work with figures or not be able to read and write, have no legal land title, all those kind of very basic, all of those very basic things that it takes to really run a business. If you look at smallholder farmers, many of them have been, let's say, included in a more commercial setting, maybe since one generation or two generations, and so there's not a big tradition yet of being a commercial grower. Most of the growers are, let's say, growers by default because they're really in that point and then in that place can't do anything else. And so that's the short-term answer. And the longer-term answer is I think indeed people need to have a prospect of, okay, when I invest in my farm, are those investments going to outperform investments that I could make in other sectors and in many parts of growing economies? That's not the case, and so you have to look at it in that respect as well. And again, as I said before, making sure that there are economies of scale, for example, through farmer cooperatives or producer associations, I think is a key element of improving productivity.
Okay, and just before I pass it on to John with any sort of additional comments, I know Ginny and Sam were pretty comprehensive. I would just like to remind the audience that this is interactive, and we will be taking questions. We've only had one so far, which is rather disappointing. But there's quite a lot of you. I think there's around 60 people that have logged in to listen to the webinar live, and I'm sure you do have questions. So please do post them in. I'll try to squeeze them in towards the end of the webinar. Anyway, John, if I may just obviously give you the chance to build on anything sort of that was said by Ginny and Sven.
Thanks, Boris. I think Ginny and Sven have covered it really well. What I'm interested in next is how you start to unlock some of these solutions. And as Sven said, the opportunity through democratic-funded, organised cooperatives to interact with these smallholder farmers is, I think, really what needs to be done to unlock the power that's sitting latently within these organisations of business people, these potential organisations of business people. And once you can build these cooperatives, then you begin to be able to find a way to interact and have leaders emerge. And let me give you an example. Fairtrade work with 62,000 sugarcane smallholders across the world. And in the last couple of years, we've been expanding our work in India, and there are about 5,000 farmers there producing 65,000 tonnes of sugar. Now, recently, 18% of the farmers have moved to drip irrigation. And that drip irrigation saves up to 50% of water used in the previous flood irrigation method. And it also has benefits in terms of productivity. Now, the cooperatives are using some of the money that they earn under sugar sold under fair trade terms to incentivise other members of the cooperative into using drip irrigation. So I think that's an example of some of the power that you can start to unlock if you can start to interact with cooperatives, and start of some of the power that corporations can start to unlock by committing to sustainable sugar policies.
I see. So democratizing the particular smallholder base into a unit, the cooperative, is a great way for not only for sort of leverage and sort of almost political power, but also in terms of investment, it can lead to encouragement and incentive for all farmers to invest. I've heard quite a few people talk about this. Is that really the key success factor, and are there any others in terms of sort of what the thrust of say, for example, a smallholder development program should look to sort of achieve? Sven, if I sort of can go back to you, is it just all about sort of creating a democratic unit, and then so many of the benefits derived from that, or is there anything else?
Well, I would say a unit where smallholder farmers work together in a way that empowers them and have them take ownership of the process is really a critical step in most of our projects as well. It doesn't, in our opinion, always have to be a cooperative. There are various ways in which you can organize a group of growers, and in such a way that they optimize, for example, economies of scale, optimize information systems, which are critical because a lot of the decisions in agriculture and smallholder farming are not made on the basis of actual information, but a lot of the decisions are, let's say, business as usual. This is how we've always done it. And so if you start to understand better what farmers need, you can have more focused interventions. And so I would say that the cooperative or producer association, or any way you structure it, is really a platform on which you can build continuous improvement programs, and that's how we structure it in many of our projects in Solidaridad, which is, there's never an end goal, in a sense, where you say, okay, now you're sustainable, now you can just sit down and do business as usual, because you can always learn. So the question is really, how do you institutionalize that continuous improvement within a setting of organized grower setting that is linked up with other stakeholders like the mill or government extension services or financial input providers, or in an enabling environment, as we call it, that supports those growers and their community in continuous improvement. And so building that structure is really a precondition to building an enterprise that is growing and links up with what the community itself needs and what the bigger community needs going forward.
Okay, so given that democratic, almost organizational structure to a collection of smallholders is really the platform, an essential platform to go on for other continuous improvement programs around technology or financing or whatever. But in that case, can I just ask you in terms of the scale of how far we are with that? What proportion of smallholders are in what cooperatives or sort of are organised in that way? Would anybody be able to give me sort of a percentage, just so that we understand sort of the scale of the challenge? And that's an open question to the audience. No, excuse me, the audience, the panel.
Boris, if I could comment on that first. I think it's John. Hi. I think that the answer is I don't know what percentage are organised, but there's an important element that needs to be in place for any program to run successfully, or any increase in the sustainability of the agriculture, and that's the smallholders have to have access to funds to do it. And probably that's the key bit that's missing, is the commitments from corporates to provide funds to enable smallholders to improve the sustainability of their production.
I see. So they can almost provide the initial spark to turn what would be a sort of a collection of smallholders into an organised unit. And that would be really that could set in motion the initiative itself, and the fact that they are entities with significant amounts of capital, and they do have a vested interest in the value chain. They would be good candidates to actually help that. And then if I can just sort of take please. Sorry, Sam.
Well, I would also. I don't have the guts to put a percentage on the answer, but I would say that most small-scale farmers in the world are organized in some way or other. The question is, how democratic are those organizations? And more importantly, what we see is that let's say the organizational or the management capacity of many of those organizations is, let's say, pretty poor. And so a big investment in the organizational quality of farmer associations or cooperatives is very often the most important spark, as you said, for improved performance. And in that sense, I think corporate parties do not need to pay forever to have sustainable production feeding into their supply chain. But if you could say there's one place where, let's say, a quality incentive can be given, I would say yes. Let's look at the institutional structures that farmers use to organize themselves with. That's really where the miracles happen, I think.
I see. And Ginny, I'd like to just give you obviously the chance to contribute. John and Sven have pretty much set the point as the sort of the key strategic consideration when you say, for example, you're designing a smallholder program, to think about the organizational structure and the institutions that the smallholders have and the quality of them as being the essential factor to bringing about progress. Would you concur that? I can imagine you probably agree with that, but then also anything else that you would sort of contribute in terms of, improvement beyond?
Yeah, sure. So I would definitely agree that this is really very important. And just to illustrate that point, in Kenya, you have most smallholders for tea organized with the Kenya Tea Development Agency, which is basically one massive co-op that bargains very well on behalf of its members and has very strong organizational capacity. And there we find that the smallholders typically get about 70% of the final price of the tea, which is really very hard to find in any other context, within tea even, in other countries, and very difficult to find in other commodities in other countries as well. So smallholders definitely very often take less than half the value of the final price, sometimes much less. And so what does that tell us? It really tells us that when you do have this very strong and well-run, capable smallholder organization representative, then they can not only do a great service for the smallholder members, but they also have much greater bargaining power towards corporations, towards any buyers, and that really helps. I mean that, of course, democratic organization of the smallholder representing organization is very, very important. I mean, I'd say there's other factors as well, which are kind of linked to that. And just one factor I'd like to highlight is the importance of sharing in the risks of the supply chain as well as the benefits. So in terms of sharing benefits, that's very clear, I guess. And productivity being the main thing, where if you raise productivity, the smallholder farmer benefits and the buyer benefits, everybody benefits. Quality is a similar win-win game. But there's also a lot of risks in smallholder agriculture, of course, where soil may be degrading, where there may be a finance crunch, where the input prices may be rising, where there may be some kind of weather shock that really decreases the harvest for that year. And in those kinds of situations, how does the supply chain address that? And there, if you have a good smallholder integrated supply chain and you're able to share in those risks so that it doesn't all fall on the smallholder farmer who then are very unable to deal with that kind of risk and is unlikely to then invest again in that value chain, then you, I think, have a much better longer term supply chain. So sharing the risks, what I mean by that, for example, is if you have environmental degradation, then investing in field schools where you can address that with the farmers to steward the environment as well as raising productivity again in that context. Where you have a finance crunch, doing pre-harvest financing so that smallholder farms are able to invest in the value chain, and then if input prices are rising, making sure that you're addressing that in your pricing so that the pricing is really cost plus and not being completely blind to the other factors that would be making the business really difficult for the smallholders. So think about the risks as well as the benefits, I would say.
And I'm conscious of the time here because I did have quite a few other topics that I did want to touch on, and we also have to get the questions from the audience in. So I'll try to streamline some of the other topics that I did want to touch on. And one of the main ones is the role of big corporates and buyers and end users, the significant ones like, for example, Unilever, Coca Cola, Mars, etc. And then the commercial case for them to actually bother with this stuff. I know earlier on when we spoke about sort of why are we even talking about smallholders, Sven mentioned the fact that they produce the food that we eat as being sort of a key consideration. So that's a question of supply security is one of the main reasons why these companies should engage with their supply bases. But sugar isn't like cocoa, for example, where corporates are concerned about growing demand not being able to be met by supply, a supply crunch. John, if I can sort of direct this question at you, in terms of, say, for example, if it isn't, I consider the whole argument of supply crunch and supply security as being one of the strongest arguments for engagement. But what are the different reasons for them to bother?
Thanks, Boris. Yeah, you're right. The market's oversupplied at the moment, or the world market's oversupplied at the moment. And possibly some time off in the future where it won't be, because the prices are too low to stimulate investment that's needed for future growth. But let's put that aside for one point. Just about every corporate social responsibility document that you'll see has something around environment, child protection, labour norms, etc. in it. Now, if you're a corporate that really wants to engage with smallholders on these issues, you're not going to achieve it by having a piece of paper that says that that's what you're going to do, and you give it to a third, your supplier, and saying, well, make sure that happens, and that will be fine. The days of corporate social responsibility stopping at that point have gone, thank goodness. So you need to be more engaged in what's happening on the ground. If you want to run, for example, a participative child protection program with smallholder communities, then you are going to need to help to build those organisations that will run those protection policies within the communities.
I see. So it is very much almost another means to achieving their sustainability goals in terms of, say, for example, their targets presumably on water, on human rights within their supply chain. This is actually a great topic that's cross-cutting for it. Just practically speaking, Sven, how can companies like Coca-Cola and Mars directly or indirectly help farmers? Earlier we mentioned, that spark of providing the initial investment or finance necessary to give the farmers the organizational structure that they need to democratize and all the benefits that come with that. But I'm sure there are multiple routes. Say, for example, I don't know, getting your purchasing managers to buy more sustainable certified sugar. What are the different ways that they can help?
So there are of course many routes, and I would say one distinction that you can make is what can we do within our direct supply chain, and another one is what can we do in the enabling environment. And so within your supply chain, I think is really about how do we empower the supply chain partners that are ahead of us. So, for example, refiners or millers, to provide a context that is more favorable to small-scale farmers, but also probably to themselves. And so how do we align the interests of everyone in the supply chain? And end-user companies tend to have, let's say, a strong position because a lot of end product is aggregated at that point in the supply chain to really start a discussion about, okay, how do we align incentives in such a way that everyone gains from it? And that means that in the procurement departments, people will have to have the understanding and the skills to start those dialogues and to maybe put a value on it. And indeed, as John says, that goes much further than simply a ticking the box exercise of we shall not have child labor in our production base. It's really about, okay, how can you positively engage those supply chain players to make a difference and to set up programs that are beneficial. Something like that, you can do that on your own, but I think very often what you want to do is to do that in a pre-competitive setting with other companies, because at the end of the day, most mills supply to various other companies, and so participating in a group, let's say in a kind of a community of change that, for example, Bon Sucro for sugarcane is, I think, a way to make sure that you don't reinvent the wheel and that you benefit from the work that others have been doing. And the same goes for other initiatives like fair trade. So going off on your own accord, I think, is not advisable here, but strengthening pre-competitive approaches that are already there and making sure that you benefit from it is very important. And then outside of the supply chain is looking at, okay, how can we create an enabling environment for small-scale farmers? So you may be able to work together with a bank to provide midterm financing on the better conditions than commercial conditions, or leverage the network that every company has in many of those countries to benefit small-scale growers. There's a whole range of solutions out there, I think, that can be unlocked, because many of the corporates have very, I would say, influential networks that can be put to work to work on this smallholder transition.
Okay. And just in terms of how satisfied, say for example, let's ask Junie, because you've got quite a good benchmark with your work with Unilever, and obviously they're renowned for their sustainability effort. You've got them as top of the behind the brand sort of classification in terms of being the company most engaged with sustainability. How satisfied are you with the general state of corporate engagement? How much room is there for them to pull up their socks and really sort of tackle these issues?
I'm surprised you asked that. There's massive room, I'd say, and I would imagine that Sven and John would say the same. That we see a lot of great initiatives being announced, and that's really super. All the more, the better. But we are talking about 500 million smallholders around the world, and not all of them are plugged into global supply chains, but some of them are, and there's a lot more that we can do. So yeah.
Okay, I've got it. Yeah, a lot more that we can do, and yeah. So I just want to take a few questions from the audience. Now these will be an eclectic bunch because I think they do touch on some great points, but at the same time they're not really, they're ad hoc and they're not connected. So I'm just going to read them out, and then please, if you have something to say, just start speaking to the panel, and then we'll obviously arrange it that way. So the first one is about is the resilience of smallholder sugarcane producers not a key issue given the challenges of climate change? And that obviously touches on climate change, which we didn't speak about, unfortunately. We should have.
Yeah. This is Sven here. Maybe I'll give it a shot. I would say resilience of smallholder farmers indeed in general is something that is worth touching upon. And having just a few hectares of one crop is a big risk in terms of resilience, I think. Luckily, it's a pretty resilient crop, but nevertheless, resilience also goes to the point of, market resilience. And so, what does the market price do? There's really not much room to influence that market price for any particular player, I think. But climate change obviously is critically important, and we've seen in places where further east, so in Australia and the Philippines, devastating effects of cyclones. We see big changes in rainfall patterns that are affecting sugarcane growing across South Asia and Southern Africa, and so that means that we will become more reliant on irrigation to deal with with shortages, for example, in water, which is a big cost factor, which again makes sugarcane farming more risky, particularly when done on a small scale. And so, and I think it's looking at how do we deal with water in particular, with water and to a lesser extent heat stress, is going to be critical in some parts of the world where we already are faced with water shortages, and climate change is going to make that question much more important still.
And I mean, I'm afraid climate change is one of those issues that we actually, as sort of even individuals or even the say broader sugar sustainability community, can have very little influence in trying to stop. It is going to be a mitigatory exercise in terms of just trying to cope with the effects of it. It is essentially a political solution, the only realistic one that we can see in terms of it being tackled. But John, I know you have some Fairtrade have done quite a lot of work on climate change, and just in terms of sort of, for example, Sven put there heat stress and water stress resilience as being sort of the key things to tackle. Would I be able to just get your general commentary on climate change and sugar production?
Well, I think the way I'd like to approach this question, Boris, is in terms of the impacts of it on the smallholder farmers. There's a tragic example in Malawi, the examples all over the world, which had devastating floods at the beginning of this year that affected sugarcane farmers who are Fairtrade certified, as well as huge swathes of the population in Malawi. So, when people ask questions around, well, does climate change, does sugarcane sustainability matter in relation to the challenges facing us on climate change? Smallholder farmers are incredibly vulnerable to climate change, so it absolutely matters that we increase the resilience of these communities through disaster risk reduction programs to try and ensure that the impact's mitigated for them.
And just to move it on to another question, because we really are, almost out of time, and that's to the diversification of means and incomes. Principally, we talked about sort of if you want to improve your livelihoods, you've only got a certain amount of land to grow on. 2 hectares, for example. I think Sven mentioned, like, on a good year, you're going to have $2,500 dollars come from that. But just in terms of the diversification of crops, say for example, as a means to building up resilience of livelihoods and the livelihoods of farmers, how much do you see that actually happening? And is it working, do you think? Is it making people more secure and less fragile towards something like, I don't know, the susceptibility of a particular crop to the effects of climate change? I'll give Junie and Sven a chance to, whoever would like to sort of take that question of diversification.
Is a reality, I think, for many smallholder farmers. You'll see that they're definitely not doing just your crop, but they're also doing some crops on the side. There might be a homestead garden where they do vegetables for the family. And then you'll often find that they also do non-farm activities. They might be driving a rickshaw in a nearby town. They might be doing any number of things, possibly up to 5 income streams. So that's probably a reality already. And then the question is, what you can do to make sure that that's sustainable regarding your crop and regarding the smallholder household's livelihood resilience. And there, I think it's really important that you are paying attention to what your crop does for the farming, for the farming soil, and for the how it fits with the income of the household overall. So we'd be really careful if your crop is particularly nutrient intensive in terms of what it takes out of the soil, that it is being cropped with other crops that replenish the soil. And these things are quite technical, but they're very important.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop the discussion there because we're out of time. I do apologize if your question wasn't answered, but I think we could have another 2-hour discussion if we had the mental energy and obviously the time, which we don't. But I'd like to thank the panel for their time and insight, and thank the audience for listening. Once again, if you are trying to engage with sort of smallholder farming issues, particularly in sugarcane, for example, but then also other crops, we are hosting the Sustainable Sugar Forum next month in London, which I would urge you to obviously to at least sort of browse to see whether you would potentially be interested in getting involved. And then also just keep engaged with Innovation Forum's activities on smallholder farming, because we do a lot of work on ethical trade, human rights, smallholder development in a range of commodities like palm oil, sugar, cotton, and we will be doing a lot more work. So please do look out for emails, and then obviously come to our event as well. So I hope you've enjoyed the webinar, and thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you, Boris.
Thanks, Boris. Thanks, Sven. Thanks, Junie. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.